You're here because you want to take better car photos. My name's Seagrin Pearson. I've been shooting cars for about 18 years now. Over that time, there are 6 items that I've used on virtually every single shoot. But stick around because there's a 7th one, and this one's going to save you hours afterwards in post-production. Let's jump in. If you've never done car photography before, you might be wondering, what do I need to take great car photos? Sometimes we see these behind the scene pictures and you have that car and it's just surrounded by all this equipment and lighting and that looks hella intimidating. Today we're going to simplify things. I'm going to show you the 6 things that I use on almost every shoot. As I dive into them, I'm going to do them in order and you'll see how they build up till eventually when you're using all of them, it gives you so much flexibility with your car photography. So let's dive in. Number 1, the first thing on our list is something that you put between your lens and your subject, in this case, our car, and that's called a polarizer. Now, I'm sure you've heard of filters. You have UV filters, you have ND filters. A polarizer is a similar type of filter. It's a very specialized piece of glass that does a very specific thing. Now, here I've got what they call a circular polarizer. Now, you might be saying, well, Seagrin, how's that work because it's square? Well, it's circular in how it behaves. You'll see what that looks like just now in a minute. You can see mine's been through a bit of the wars. The edges have seen some damage. You slide this into a holder, which then goes onto the front of your lens. Popping the circular polarizer on your lens does a few things. Firstly, it enhances the colors and contrast of how the camera sees your scene. The way light wavelengths work is that the polarizer will cut out certain of those light waves from entering into your lens, thus not being recorded by the camera. So it changes the way light is perceived by your camera completely. This will result in more contrast in your scenes, and it also actually enhances some colors. You'll see now how the red on this car will change completely to a deeper red once you put that polarizer in front of the lens. And I haven't put the polarizer on yet because I want you to actually see the difference between before and after. A polarizer helps cut certain wavelengths that have to do with reflections. Now, when it comes to cars are just basically one giant ball of reflective surfaces. So that polarizer suddenly has a massive effect on the reflections that the camera and we see in the car. When the filter's in front of the lens, we can turn that filter and rotate it so that the polarization areas are affecting the areas that we want on our car. Now, more often than not, the polarization effects are generally your bonnet and your windscreen or the side of the car. So let me show you the difference in what that looks like. So this is what the car looks like without the polarizer. And then if we bring it over, firstly, you can see how much it cuts light into the scene. So I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit while we have our polarizer on. But look how deep that red is on the car now versus without. As you rotate it, look at the difference in what it does to the bonnet and the windscreen. And then if we keep rotating, you'll notice the side of the car gets a little bit of polarization. But from this angle, predominantly, you're seeing the bonnet and the windscreen. Item number 2 is the humble tripod. Now, that might be a bit lame to put a tripod on the list, but I was never a tripod guy when I started out. I always felt like they hindered my ability to move around and be creative and all that. So I'm not putting this on the list just to fill space. I've learned that the tripod is one of the most useful things that we can have as photographers, and especially car photographers if we're working on our own. So the good old humble tripod serves a few purposes for us as car photographers. Most of them is that we can get a little bit more technical with our shots. Yes, being able to move around freely is great for creativity, but the second we want to add in a little bit of technicality to our shots, and cars sometimes do require a little bit of technicality, the tripod is going to come in and it's going to really set the foundation for what you're going to build on. So this ability to be able to lock our camera in place, like I have the camera locked off now in place, means that we can have the same frame repeatedly again and again. Now, we did just look at the polarizer and how the polarizer moves around and you can polarize different areas of the car. Now, What would you do if, say, for example, you wanted to put two areas of polarization together, but they didn't line up perfectly? Well, this is where the tripod comes in, because now you're going to have two shots perfectly aligned with different polarization areas, maybe one for the sky and one for the car. You can now combine these together in post-production much easier than if you were just holding the camera in free space trying to get the same frame. When you're shooting a brief, often you're going to want to have to find that one angle with the camera angle just right that your client loves and the agency loves. And this is the way that we can kind of save and load a location. It's kind of like the closest we're going to get to a save and reload in life. And I have a bird that's sitting on my camera right now. Sure, come on, go. A tripod really is going to be one of your best friends when shooting, especially if you have to sometimes shoot alone, which does happen. This is going to help you so much and then essentially becomes the foundation for the next step. Item number 3. And this, I would say, goes to a remote shutter release. Now, this is a remote shutter release. It's wireless, which means that the one part, this part, plugs into your camera. Each camera has a slightly different port for this. Nikon has a certain one, Sony. So just make sure you get the correct one for your camera brand. Then the other part, the trigger, this is what you keep with yourself. Now, as you can see, we're slowly building up here. So we have our camera that is on our tripod and it's locked in place. Then we have our polarizer, which is on our lens and it's polarizing our car. But now we want to be able to trigger the camera. Now, if we're alone, this remote shutter release becomes your best friend, because if I was trying to shoot now today, I would have to run to the camera, push the button, run to the car, do something that I need to do, and then run back again constantly. Whereas with the remote shutter release, I can make sure this is plugged into the camera. I can have this in my hand, in my pockets, and as I'm here, far away from the camera, I can still remotely release the shutter. I can hear you asking, why do I need to be able to be remote and away from my camera when I'm wanting to shoot? Well, that leads us into item number 4, something called an off-camera flash. Lighting conditions aren't always perfect for us when we're shooting. Some days you have amazing light to work with, but then other days you have no sunlight or even just very, very hard daylight in the middle of the day. What's really nice is when you shoot at times like today where it's at sunset, the lighting does all of the work for you. This is a little speedlight unit. This is the smallest version that you can get if you're on a budget. If you have a little bit more budget, you can get one that is battery packed. This is often a little bit higher wattage. You can dial in your settings a little bit nicer because you have more light power to work with. I always try to let my natural light do as much of this work for me as possible. Like I've positioned the car here so that that sunlight is lighting up this entire side of the car. And basically only here is where I'm dealing with a little bit of shadow. And this is easy to correct. This is where my flash comes in. How do we use it? Well, this is where they all start coming together. I can be here. I can have my shutter release remote that I hold in my hand, and I have my speed light, and I can move freely, come to the shadow side, hold the flash where I need to, pop it off, and as soon as I fire it, that will fire the flash into the car wherever I need it. Number 5 on the list has to do with focal lengths, i.e. lenses. So there's 2 real focal lengths here that I want to mention that you can easily use to cover virtually everything that you need to do. Now, for most of my work, I use a 24-70. That 24 millimeter gives me an amazing wide angle that I can use for interior sometimes, or if I'm shooting a vehicle that needs something that has a little bit of a distortion effect, I will use that. But most of the time, between 35 and 70 mils is a great focal length for cars. You can even go telephoto if you have a 70-200 maybe. But what that does is it creates a lot of compression in the frame. And it does change how that car actually looks. I'm going to show you the difference between the 24 mils and 70 mils so that you can see the difference in how the car actually physically looks. Now, when it comes to shooting cars, I can tell you that manufacturers are often very particular about how their car looks, how those dimensions are translated visually through the lens. And we control that using our focal length. So let me show you the difference between 24 and 70 mils. All right, so here is our car at 24 millimeters. Now, this car we have today, the Mercedes CLE 300, it's got a very long nose, which is quite pronounced. As you bring the camera closer, you'll notice how much more bulbous that front end starts looking at 24 millimeters. So you'll notice the closer we are to the car, the more that bulge becomes predominant. And the more we move away, it sort of goes away a little bit, but still we can see how it affects that car's front and the dimensions there. So here we're going from 24 mils, and if we rack all the way to 70 mils, notice how there's no distortion on the car and that front nose. The entire car's line looks well balanced from front headlights all the way to rear arch. Item number 6 is this bad boy. This little cheap 5-in-1 reflector, or even this piece of white cloth. What the hell are we going to do with a reflector that is so tiny compared to the rest of the size of the car? I mean, look at the size of this versus the whole car. How is this going to work? Swish. A reflector is basically going to help us when we're wanting to do detail shots. Now, a car, as we've said, is one giant, massive, just reflective surface, but it's also made up of different kinds of materials. We have metal, we have glass, we have chrome, we have black plastic, we have shiny black plastic. So there's a lot of different surface areas that react slightly differently when it comes to reflections and the environment around it. So a reflector comes in handy when I'm needing to do something close up or a detail shot of something that is ideally with chrome or something that has a very metallic type finish. All right, so I'm going to bring you in here. I'm going to put you right here where we're going to have the close-up of the front of this car's grille. Now, you'll notice immediately that it looks quite dark. There's not much on the other side of this car to reflect into the grille. Watch what happens when I put this reflector over here. Notice how as I move this around and I give that chrome something to reflect, what we're doing is we're giving something to reflect back into this part of the car. And in this case, we're focusing. Let's try this again. You've made it to the end, and I did say that there was a bonus one for you. Number 7, the thing that I always have in my camera bag. Sounds like a sponsorship, it really isn't, but it's this Meguiar's Clean and Shine. I always make sure that I have one of these bottles and a microfiber cloth in my camera bag, because this means that I can ensure that my car is clean when I'm shooting. The last thing you want is to get back to your computer and you're looking at your images and suddenly you realize there's a bird poop that you didn't clean off, or a spot that now you have to clone out of every single image. Sometimes it's just better to make sure that your car is clean from the outset. It saves you hours of time later on. Don't be lazy in those initial stages. There's that, we'll fix it in post thing. That fixing it in post takes hours of your time that you could have saved. So that's the 7 things that I always have on my car shoots. Which ones are you going to try use? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.